Never settle for an answer to your query or question which you do not find totally satisfying. Keep at it. Never take shortcuts.
Arvind Sharma joins me to discuss his living legacy. Truly one of the greatest, undoubtedly, thinkers of our times. Welcome, Professor Arvind Sharma. I'm so delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you, Yannick.
To start with, walk us through a little bit about your childhood and who you grew up in India and why you ultimately decided to pursue further university studies in the United States.
So I was born in the city of Benares, which is now called Varanasi in North India. But I had my early education in Delhi. And after that, I became a civil servant for 6 years in the state of Gujarat in India. And then, after that interval, I resumed my academic career. I came to the United States and was working towards a PhD in economics at Syracuse University when my interest began to shift. I was doing a PhD in economics, but in doing that, in the course of doing that, I became interested in the role of non-economic factors in economic development, especially in the context of a country like India. And while exploring the role of non-economic factors, I became particularly interested in the role of religion in economic development. And so, to equip myself for working on that theme, I decided to do a degree in theology. So I obtained a master's in theological studies from the Harvard Divinity School, but then my interest shifted further into religion itself and to religion and human life. So it broadened out, and I finally ended up taking a PhD from Harvard University from the Department of Sanskrit and Indian Studies. I specialized in Hinduism, and I wrote my doctoral work on a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, the popular Indian text, by Abhinav Gupta. He is a 10th century commentator on that text from Kashmir. While I was finishing my work, I was hired by the University of Brisbane in Australia as their first appointee in the field of Asian religions at their newly founded department for the study of religion. And so I taught there for a while and then moved to the University of Sydney, again in Australia. While I was teaching there, I was hired by McGill University in 1987. And I've been teaching here since, here at McGill, for the past 30 years.
Can you tell us a little bit, what were some factors that really drove this interest in religion? You know, at first sight, it might seem far-fetched, but the two actually, they really interact somehow very critically, especially in the context of India. And also, what is really interesting, I mean, you experienced still when India was occupied by the British, and you were basically a child of Gandhi's legacy. Can please walk us a little bit through your childhood and how it influenced your studies?
Yes, I think my childhood, as probably in the case of most people, had a profound influence on my later growth. I still remember the day on which India became independent. I was a 7-year-old child, and I just walked into the veranda and I saw buntings being put up and festoons being used to decorate the environment. So I asked my mother, what's going on? So she said, the British are leaving. So I said, when did they come? So she said about 200 years ago. So what were they doing here? So they were ruling over us. I still remember my sense, actually I should say anger. I felt at this fact, the anger I felt that somebody else could rule over us. I still remember that. Totally spontaneous reaction to the situation. And then, of course, as I grew up, I realized that India is very poor. So that was one of the reasons for my interest in economics, because economics was the science which dealt with these things. And then, of course, I have recounted the rest of my journey. Yes. The rest of my trajectory already.
Are there any special attributes that you could potentially pin down that really made you the person that you became today? And really here I asking really the brilliant, outstanding scholar that you are, but also really the human being. And my guess is the two, we can't really separate the two.
No, I think a very important factor in my future development was the impression I formed that the information about my religion and my culture and my country, which I encountered in reading accounts about it, especially in the English language, seemed to me to be unrepresentative of the country, the religion, and the culture as I knew it. So this has been an important factor in my involvement. I think I discovered this when I was doing economics, and the state of India, the economic state of India, was often explained in terms of the Hindu value system. So my master's dissertation, or perhaps I should call it a thesis, was on the Hindu scriptural value system and India's economic development. And so you can already see the shift, the direction of the shift in my interest while I was writing my master's thesis. When finally I came to the doctoral work, the department told me that we would like you to work on some orthodox topic, conventional topic, and get your degree and do your work, get on with a job. But I tried to point it out to them that my interest in economics is not purely theoretical. I do have India's poverty in mind, as a problem to be solved. So then they said that we have nobody to supervise your work. In any case, you do not have any formal background in the study of religion. So that is when I offered to get a degree. And while I was working on that, my interest shifted almost totally into religion. So I think the appeal of religion comes from the fact that it offers us the broadest possible explanation of the human situation. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if I have a toothache, I go to a dentist and he takes care of it. If I have a headache, I go to a doctor and she takes care of it. If I have a political problem, I enter politics myself, or I go to the representative in the parliament and he takes care of it. So all these various elements in life about which you may have questions are taken care of by the respective specialists in these. But what about life itself? As a whole, you see, science can offer an answer to pain, especially medical science. But can it offer an answer to suffering? Why do we suffer? So religion as a field of study addresses this fundamental, or rather this fundamental question and such fundamental questions as who are we, where are we going, what are we doing here, and so on.
I see your point, but there are also many people who never really bother with these deep questions that you did. Can you walk us a little bit through, when you felt like, well, you have like different questions in mind than others might have had, your colleagues, for example, when you were young, whether any, your mother or your father who there was something that they taught you, that they modeled, that you really picked up and that deeply shaped your interest in these deep, perennial, really, questions?
Well, these issues were not discussed directly. Yeah? We never sat down, and my parents never sat me down and said, now we have this problem of suffering. Yeah? Or how do we decide what to do the right thing? All these large questions were never raised as such. But when I look back now, I find that the answers to these questions were discussed all the time. The questions were implicit in the discussions. So I think my father had a fine library of all the major Indian thinkers of the 20th century, especially of the first half. And so I would browse on those books. My mother was a devout Hindu, so she fasted regularly, observed all the festivals. We attended several lectures by holy men. But we were never asked to believe in anything. Never. And if we had no interest in it, they didn't ask us to go even. They would just say, are you interested? Would you like to come? So we would go on the days we wanted. We would not go on the days we were not interested in. I'm sure if I was interested in art or sports, rather than in these questions, they would have encouraged me to follow that. I remember, I now that at my age now, I realize what a privileged upbringing that was. Absolutely no pressure at all. And we had scriptures of all the religions of the world around in the house.
I mean, this is so beautiful. And really, I don't know if I think self-determination theory didn't exist at the time, but I think that's what really how your upbringing was by your parents. And I think that's why you became, I think this is one really the key, the fundament why you became one of the greatest thinkers, because you ultimately had this ability to pursue your interests, and they just had this almost divine confidence to let you pursue whatever you felt, due to the fact that they didn't pressure you, but they let you, like a free bird, explore the world. Do you think like
But
this is an accurate description?
yeah, well, I should add though that this was not unique to our family. I can say with some confidence that this was true of almost all my friends or the circle I moved in. There was this freedom. And all of us had it. All my friends had it. All my school fellows had it. Nobody really asked us to believe in something. They insisted that we behave properly and have a certain kind of a basically decent moral code to live by. But beyond that, there were no restrictions.
So this really, it's really a privilege, as you just pointed out beforehand, how your upbringing was. And I think you must be so indebted to your parents, the way they brought you up. It's fantastic. How do you, I assume that they are now your late parents. So how did you celebrate, them, when they were, I mean, I don't know, but can you elaborate a little bit, like the relationship that you cultivated with your parents?
Well, in my later life, I had to move away from my family because they had very traditional notions of about what job I should follow and the kind of life I should lead. It was in my best interest, I recognize that, in what they thought would be my best interest, but it was not what I thought was my interest. And so I gradually drifted away. That is why I left my job for what I thought. Job was fine, but I wanted to spend the rest of my life in a vocation which excited me more. And so I changed my field and became an academic. But I'm deeply grateful to them for the upbringing I had. I mean, my father on one day would be reading the life of Lenin, and on another day would be reading the Imitation of Christ. And because of that, we would become aware of those books and their content and would have some discussion about those things.
So how did they react when you decided to go to the US and to pursue your passions, really your vocation and really your purpose, in my view? And correct me if I'm wrong, but that, to me, that is your purpose on this earth, is to educate, because in a few 2000 years, we will talk about yourself the same as we talk, in a Western sense about Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. I mean, that's a fact.
Well, Yannick, I'm a bit embarrassed at the fact that you are putting me, you are bracketing me with Plato and Socrates and people like that. I'm just a student of comparative religion, and I have absolutely no idea what influence I will have, if any, in the future, or any influence I have, if any, in the present. But I have to admit that I do relish reading and sharing the thoughts of these great thinkers. of various systems of philosophy and various religious traditions and so on.
Just quickly touch on that, because this is typically, always the greatest intellectual. They always talk this, because it seems like reading Socrates, where he really states, the more I know, the more basically I don't know. In other words, the more question, opens up too. So there's always this paradox where we learn more, but we see this in physics, we see this in all the fields of studies, right? So how do you deal with that, in being such a deep thinker, and you know more and more? And do you also almost feel like you stand in front of an ocean and there is always it's just opening more and more up? And how does it make you feel?
That's a very good question. It's an excellent question. I hope my answer has some merit in it. Well, see, one of the great discoveries which one makes as one becomes an academic is that knowledge has no frontier. But it is not unsettling. This is the odd thing about it. What you discover is that, well, let me use two metaphors, to describe to you what one discovers. These metaphors have been used by other people, and I'm invoking them because they are very useful. One of them has been used by Houston Smith. He writes somewhere that the larger the island of knowledge, the longer the shoreline of ignorance. The more we know, the more we come in contact with areas we don't know about. So I think it's a very graphic metaphor, an island of knowledge. As it expands, the area over which it is in touch with the ocean goes on increasing. The other metaphor is used by C.E.M. Joad, a British thinker, and he says, if you light a small lamp, then it emits light, and the light has a certain orb. Because it's a small light, it has a small orb. But if you light a larger lamp, maybe an electric lamp, then compared to the earthenware lamp you had earlier, the orb of light is greater, right? So you think you have more light. Yes, you have more light. But at the same time, the number of points at which that light is in touch with darkness also increases. Because the orb is larger. Nevertheless, you don't feel demoralized because you have more light also if you have more darkness. So the question is, how do you face this situation? Now, this is a very exciting situation. This is not demoralizing. You discover more and more. You move, in a sense, from truth to truth. Now, of course, there are three ways of describing the situation. You can say that you move from truth to truth, some light to more light, to even more light. Or you can say you move from darkness to darkness, from a smaller circle of darkness surrounding the light to a larger circle of darkness surrounding the light. Or you can say you move from falsehood to truth to the extent that you might judge your previous knowledge inadequate. So there's a different ways of describing the same phenomenon. But the overall phenomena is positive, or rather are positive.
That is beautifully, said, and it's very encouraging, to hear this from someone like you, because, I can't really imagine, or I can't really think of you not being academic, obviously, that you are. Can you tell me a little bit about your life and how academics, intersects with your life as a, your scholar and your human being? And is there any separation? I can't really imagine. I imagine that, this is truly the oxygen, of your soul while studying and reading and writing. So can you walk us a little bit through your life, and it really seems that you are embodied. You're an embodied academic, that really breathes from day and night what you're doing. That is outstanding as scholarship.
So there are some great advantages to being an academic. I'll also come to the drawbacks later. Let us first focus on the positive side. One of them is that the non-academic life is very rewarding. You probably make more money. You probably get more professional recognition, and so on. But what it lacks is the opportunity to sit back and reflect on what is going on. This is also true of marriage. While you are in a marriage, you have very little time to reflect on marriage itself, the phenomenon of marriage. Similarly, if you lead a busy life, you have very little time to reflect on the phenomenon of life itself as it is being led. Now, I think society pays us academics for having the time to reflect on these things. One way of looking at it would be to say that, look, we are in a rush all the time, but could you just figure out where we are going and tell us whether we are on the right path? You can't do this while traveling with us, because that is so time consuming and energy absorbing. Therefore, we are allowing you the time and the energy by giving you a job in which you don't have to do the kind of things we do. You have the time to reflect and tell us where we are headed. So this is one luxury the academics enjoy. Or you might even call it a privilege. Now, what this allows one to do is to reflect on something from different points of view. So that just look at religion. You can look at religion from a historical point of view. Look at it from an anthropological point of view. You can look at it from what I just said, anthropological, from a sociological point of view. from a phenomenological point of view, from a hermeneutical point of view, and so on, from a Marxist point of view. So you can look at the phenomenon from these various angles. And all these various angles bring some aspect of it to light. They throw some new light, and they also highlight certain aspects. Now comes the difficult part. Because society also expects us then to offer some guideline on the basis of this. So that is why we write our books and papers. It may give us this privilege of being in the academia for simple matters like how can we make something better? How can we cure a disease? Or what is the meaning of life? But I think the common dimension of the academia is that you can sit back and look at what is being done or what is happening and analyze it. And analyze it in a way which improves human well-being, or what we love to call human flourishing. Now here comes the drawback of the academic life. Because you have so many perspectives from which you can look at something, and you see the merit of all of these, you may have a very difficult time making up your mind as to what is the best way or even the right way to go. So when non-academics make fun of the academics, they often say, the academics don't help us very much, because they will begin by saying on the one hand, and then they will say on the other hand. And so you don't know which hand to shake. But there's a very important principle involved here, and that is the principle of volition. That is, the academic is in a very difficult situation. If the academic himself becomes fully convinced of one solution, then he or she is no longer an academic. That person is an advocate of a certain position. Now, you might argue that advocacy is also a part of being in the academia. We call it engaged scholarship. And I would agree with that. But it's a slightly different kind of engagement than the pure academic one, which is to just lay down the options and their relative merits and demerits. But the problem is that when you become an advocate, to the extent that you are yourself an advocate, you tend to become less and less of an academic in the sense I've just described, a neutral, objective observer.
And this is a really interesting point, because I think more and more, and that's why academia to some extent loses its credibility, because there are more and more advocates now we have, instead of actually academics like you are, and really ivory tower thing that really can guide us and society to better waters. And I think that's a very difficult kind of very thin line we are currently walking on, which is certainly also preoccupying yourself, as you just said. Well, of course, you said the two, they have merits, but it's a thin line.
Yeah, I think there is a way of walking that thin line, and that is to be very conscious of what one is doing. So you can always say, I'm now playing my role as an academic, and then make some statements. And then say, now I'm going to be an advocate. I think this is the best solution for these reasons. So if you specify them, then you are being more honest with both yourself and others. And the fact that might be tension between the two roles, and remember, it's a very creative tension. It can be retained in a healthy way. To give you an example from my own field of study, I may go into a holy place, like into a church, and I may go there as an academic. But I may also go and get married in the same church. Right? But so long as I can keep these two roles clear and distinct, if connected. So it's possible, I think, to walk that line. And you might also make a larger judgment that at the moment the society is in a state in which I can play my role as an academic to the hilt, because that is what will benefit society most. And in some situations, you might come to the conclusion that society needs my participation. I am now going to put on the boots of an advocate and spend the rest of my life doing something. Because that is what I think will help society more. So it's negotiable.
Let's move a little bit on and to you. And I think really what you're talking about, academia and you're academic, I think it's right to say that this is truly your purpose. And when did you figure out that being or becoming an academic is your purpose of your life?
You see, the formal way in which I am now talking about the academia and advocacy and things like that came much later in life. In the beginning, it was just the desire to know. I found it extremely exciting when I started my study of philosophy, that there are so many ways in which people have envisioned who we are, where are we going, which is the best way of getting there. And so I found it extremely exciting. Okay, this is one way which humanity came up with. Okay, this is another way it came up with. Okay, at this stage it thought that religion does not offer us a good guide. It gave up religion, it became secular. So what did the secularists think? What views did they develop? So it's all dealing with us, our life. How should we lead it? So I found this terribly exciting.
And I think this is a really good point that you mentioned. Secular life is now very prominent and important. Can you elaborate a little bit? What do you think? And you already mentioned a little bit what religion really does. It gives you a comprehensive picture of life. What will you say religion, does to you, and why you think it might be very helpful to follow, for example, a religion in order to live a meaningful life?
Yeah. So you see, the effect religion has on a person's belief systems, as he comes to know about more and more belief systems and systems of practice also. These two things go together. The effect is often paradoxical. And the paradox is that you become both more appreciative of the tradition you belong to, as well as of the traditions, the new tradition you learn about. So you become more deeply connected both with your own tradition and with all the other traditions you read about. Now, this produces a very subtle shift in one's understanding of how life is to be understood. You reach a stage where you ask, okay, I am a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Jain or a Sikh or a Baha'i or a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian or a Taoist or a Confucian or a follower of Shinto or of indigenous religions. No? I am somewhere on this spectrum. But I also have the whole of the spectrum at my disposal. Yes? So what am I first? Am I first a Hindu or am I first a human being? So one could argue that in order to be a Hindu, or let me backtrack. You ask, can you be a Hindu without being a human being? What do you think, Yanni?
Not really.
No. But can you be a human being without being a Hindu?
I believe so, yeah.
Yes. So being a human being is a more fundamental category than being a Hindu. In this manner. Okay. So if I'm a human being, and that's a primary category, at least for the moment for us, then am I not the inheritor of the entire religious past of humanity? Not just my religion. Do not all religions belong to me? And don't I belong to all religions as a human being? And so you reach some such point, and where you fully realize how being Hindu is a way of being human, and being a Christian is a way of being human, and being a Marxist is a way of being human. There might also be a human being of being human. Which is to accept all of these as my legacy. So in that, what that happens is that Islamism is not just an Islamic issue, or the so-called Islamic terrorism, quote unquote, is not just something the problem with Islam. It is your problem also. Christian imperialism is not just a problem for Christianity. It is also your problem. Caste discrimination, if it has existed in Hinduism, is not just a Hindu problem. It is also your problem. So you get this kind of the broadening of horizon. It is not as if you have no place to go. You have many places to go. And you are free to go from place to place.
But it is also special, especially religion in itself. There's still a difference, a huge difference between a religion and ideology, for example, that's being a Marxist, because religion is really, it's rooted in, in history to some extent. And there's something very powerful in it. It's like culture. I mean, we can't really separate culture from religion. And there are, anthropologists who actually say, well, religion, or, as Girard, for example, pointed out, that religion was the very backbone of human culture. In other words, without it, human culture could never ever have evolved.
Okay, many issues are involved here. One is, say, a difference between religion and ideology. And the other is a difference between religion and culture. Yeah? So let us first take the difference between religion and ideology for further consideration. Now, many scholars point out that one major difference between ideology and religion is the rejection of the transcendental in ideology. There is nothing beyond our normal human existence. Religion insists that there is something beyond this also. That's what we call the transcendental. Or in the language of theology, we contrast the transcendent and the immanent. Yeah? And so while religion says that there is a transcendent dimension to life, the ideology says, no, it is only immanent. It's only what we have here. But that could be a valid way of looking at things. The only problem arises if the immanent, those who maintain this position, are going to rule the other position out of court. They're not even worth considering or allowing. And if the transcendental position did the same to the immanent, that's where the problem arises. You have to keep these balls in play. Now, modern civilization has done a good job of that, keeping these in play so far. When we are at a university, we are free to pursue all these options or their combinations. So that's about, and of course, there is the problem of people start using religion as ideologies or ideologies as religions. The relationship between religion and culture is more subtle. You can have a view in which religion is the broader category and culture is subsumed in it. You can have the opposite view that culture is the larger category and religion is subsumed in it. But independently of these divisions, the broad points we have been discussing about keeping all options open and in play. Still holds, I think.
Now, I want to ask you, what is, according to you, the meaning of life?
Well, at one level, one could say, is precisely to find this meaning. Let me try to elaborate on that. One question which immediately surfaces is whether life has an intrinsic meaning which we have to discover, or whether life is something to which we have to impart meaning, confer meaning on. And of course, then you can ask, why should life be meaningful? Is life meaningful? Is a harder question to answer, that is intrinsically meaningful, than the question, should life be meaningful? Because I think we intuitively feel that a meaningless life may not be really quite worth living. This leads to a very important, or rather, this leads our discussion into a very significant direction. How do we decide what to do when we cannot decide on the value of any course of action on the basis of truth, or on the basis of information which can be empirically settled? We are having difficult times these days because of COVID-19, I guess. Yeah, am I saying it right? Because of COVID. Now, which is the best way to deal with COVID is a question which can be settled empirically. Right? And whether life is worth living or not is also a question we might be able to settle empirically by arguing that it is better to have a meaningful life than a meaningless life. But whether it is good to believe in God or not is very difficult to settle on the question of whether God exists or not. That is, in terms of its truth value. And since many of the questions, the larger questions of life, belong to this category, how do we settle them? Or at least deal with them? Now, one very interesting approach to this question, which has been recommended by scholars like William James earlier, or Houston Smith, or even by the Buddha, by the way, seems to be that when we are dealing with such questions, we should ask, which belief is most helpful for me? So the Buddha says, we don't know whether there is rebirth. If you think that we don't know whether there is rebirth or not, whether we survive death or not, ask yourself the question, would life be more meaningful if I believed that we survive death? Would it be more meaningful if I believed that we don't survive? Within the kind of the framework in which we live, which has evolved in the course of our discussion here, our discussion of light and darkness, those orbs of light and darkness, the island of knowledge and the shoreline of ignorance, and the various options we have in life in terms of religions and ideologies. In terms of that framework, this might be one way of proceeding.
Fascinating. Just one last question. In terms of what we just were discussing, really about the meaning of life, what is your most important life advice to a human being to live a purposeful and meaningful life?
One thought which came to mind was to say, don't sell yourself short. The other thought which came was, never give up. Never settle for an answer to your query or question which you do not find totally satisfying. Keep at it. Never take shortcuts.
That really is so critical. But also the thing is usually that, human beings, they usually, most of the time, even though it doesn't any good for them, but they actually look all the time for shortcuts in life. Why is that? Even though we know that it's not good for us, we still are always looking, or most of us at least, looking for the shortcuts, with then obviously at the detriment, in my view, and I think also according to you, that jeopardizes really having a meaningful and purposeful life.
Yeah, I don't know why. A passage from the Upanishads is beginning to flicker in my memory, where the sage advises the man asking the questions that there are two courses in life always available to us. That which gives us immediate satisfaction, which he calls prayas, and that which leads to good in the long run, which he calls shreyas. And that we have this choice at every moment in our life. And that we should try to choose shreyas.
Beautiful. Professor Arvind Sharma, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's truly a honor, and it's so deep listening to you. It's oxygen, I think, for any soul.
My pleasure.
Arvind Sharma.